Well, this is a story about something that happened long ago when your grandfather was a child. It is a very important story because it shows how all the comings and goings between our own world and the land of Narnia first began. In those days, Mr. Sherlock Holmes was still living in Baker Street, and the Bastables were looking for treasure in the Lewisham Road. In those days, if you were a boy, you had to wear a stiff Eton collar every day, and the schools were unusually nastier than they are now. But meals were very nice. And as for sweets, I won't tell you how cheap and good they are, because it would only make your mouth water. And in those days, there lived in London a girl named Polly Plummer. She lived in one of a long row of houses which were all joined together. One morning, she was out in the back garden when a boy scrambled up from the garden next door and put his face over the wall. Polly was very surprised because up until now, she had never seen children in that house, but only Mr. Ketterley and Miss Ketterley. They were a brother and sister who lived together in the house. So she looked up full of curiosity. The face on the strange boy was very grubby. It could hardly have been grubbier if he had rubbed his hands in the dirt and then had a good cry and then dried his face with his hands. That's how grubby he was. It looked like he had been crying and rubbed his face with dirty hands. Hello, said Polly. Hello, said the boy. What's your name? He said. Polly, she said. What's yours? Diggory, said the boy. I say, what a funny name, said Polly. It isn't half as funny as Polly, said Diggory. Yes, it is, said Polly. No, it isn't, said Diggory. At any rate, I do wash my face, said Polly, which is what you need to do, especially after. Then she stopped. She had been going to say, after you've been blubbering or crying, but she thought that wouldn't be polite. Let me show you a picture. Diggory and Polly. All right, I have then, said Diggory in a much louder voice, like a boy who was so miserable he didn't care who knew he had been crying. And so would you cry, he went on, if you'd lived all your life in the country and had a pony and a river at the bottom of the garden and then been brought to live in a beastly hole like this. London isn't a hole, said Polly, but the boy was too wound up to take any notice of her, and he went on. And if your father was away in India and you had to come and live with your aunt and uncle who's crazy, who would like that? And if the reason was that they were looking for your mother and if your mother was ill and was going to die, and then his face went the wrong sort of shape as if he was going to cry really hard. I didn't know, said Polly. I'm sorry. And then, because she hardly knew what to say, and also to turn Diggory's mind to cheerful things, she asked, Hey, is Mr. Ketterley really crazy? Well, he's either crazy, said Diggory, or there's something about mystery, some other mystery. He has a study on the top floor, and Aunt Letty says I must never go up there. Well, that looks fishy to begin with. And then there's another thing. Whenever he tries to say anything to me at mealtimes, he never gets to talk because of her. She always shuts him up. She says, don't worry the boy, Andrew. And I'm sure Diggory doesn't want to hear about that. Or else Diggory doesn't want to hear about anything that you have to say. Once in a while, she'd say, now, Diggory, wouldn't you like to go and play in the garden? What sort of things does he try to say? I don't know. He never gets very far. There's more than that. One night, it was last night, in fact, as I was going past the foot of the attic stairs on my way to bed, I'm sure I heard a yell. Polly said, well, perhaps he keeps a crazy wife shut up in there. Yes, I've thought of that, said Diggory. Or Or he might be a pirate, like a man in the beginning of Treasure Island, and he's always hiding from other shipmates. How exciting, said Polly. I never knew your house was so interesting. You may think it's interesting, said Diggory, but you wouldn't like it if you had to sleep there. How would you like to lie awake listening for Uncle Andrew's step to stop creaking along the passage to your room? And he has awful eyes. That was how Polly and Diggory got to know one another. And as it was in the beginning, the summer holidays, and neither of them were going to see that year, that meant they were nearly going to be together every day. Their adventures became chiefly because it was one of the wettest and the coldest summers there for years. They drove them to do indoor things. You might say indoor exploration. It is wonderful how much exploring you can do with a stump of a candle in a big house or in a row of houses. Polly had discovered how long ago that if you opened a certain little door in the box room attic of her house, you could find the cistern and a dark place behind in which you could get into by a little careful climbing. I need to take a drink. Hold on. The darkest place was like a long tunnel with a brick wall on one side and sloping roof on the other. And in the roof, there were little chunks of light between the slats. And there was no floor in the tunnel. You had to step from rafter to rafter to rafter in between them, or you'd fall through the plaster. If you stepped on this, you would just find yourself falling right through the ceiling of the room below. Here's a picture. See? Polly had used a bit of the tunnel just beside the cistern as a smuggler's cave. She had brought up bits of old packing cases and the seats of broken kitchen chairs and things of that sort, and spread them across from rafter to rafter so she could make a bit of a floor. Here she kept a cash box containing various treasures and a story she had written, and usually a few apples. She had often drunk a quiet bottle of ginger ale in there. The old bottles made it look like a smuggler's cave, like kind of like a pirate's cave. Diggory quite liked the cave. She wouldn't let him see the story, but he was more interested in exploring. Look here, he said. How long does this tunnel go on for? I mean, does it stop where your house ends? No, said Polly. The walls don't go out over the roof. It just goes on and on. I don't know how far. Then we could get the whole length of the whole row of houses. So we could, said Polly. And oh, I say, we could get into other houses. Yes, and get taken up for burglars. No, thank you. Don't be so clever. I was thinking of the house beyond yours. What about it? Well, it's an empty house, right? Daddy said it's always been empty ever since we came to live here. I suppose we ought to have a look at it then, said Diggory. He was a good deal more excited than you'd have thought from the way he spoke, for of course he was thinking, just as you would have been, of all the reasons why the house might have been empty for so long. So was Polly. Neither one of them said the word haunted. And both felt that once the thing had been suggested, it would be hard not to forget about it. Shall we go and try it out now? Said Diggory. All right, said Polly. Don't if you'd rather not, said Diggory. I'm game if you are, she said. How are we to know when we're in the next house? Well, they decided that they would have to go out into the box room and walk across it, taking steps as long as the steps from one rafter to the next. And that would give them an idea of how many rafters were in each room. And then they would allow for 4 more for the passage between the 2 attics into Polly's house. And then the next same number for the maid's bedroom as for the box room. And that would give them the length of the house. So they were measuring out how far apart their different houses were that were connected to each other. When they had done that distance twice, they would be at the end of Diggory's house. Any door they came to after that would let them into an attic of someone else's house. And eventually they'd get to the empty house. But I don't expect it's always really empty at all, said Diggory. Well, what do you expect? Said Polly. I expect someone lives there secretly, only coming in and out at night with a lantern. We shall probably discover a gang of criminals and get a reward. It's all rot to say a house would be empty all these years unless there's some mystery. Daddy thought it must be all the drains, said Polly. Pooh. Grown-ups are always thinking uninteresting explanations, said Diggory. Now that we're talking by daylight in the attic instead of by candlelight in the smuggler's cave, it seemed much less likely that the empty house would be haunted. And when they measured the attic, they had got a pencil to do the math. They both got different answers, so they did it again. They were in a hurry to start their exploration. We mustn't make a sound, said Polly, because it's such an important occasion. They took a candle each. Polly had a good store of those candles in her cave. It was very dark and dusty and drafty, and they stepped from rafter to rafter without a word, except when they whispered to one another, "We're opposite your attic now," or "This must be halfway through our house." And neither of them stumbled, and the candles didn't go out. And at last they came where they could see a little door in the brick wall on their right. See, here's the picture. There was no bolt, no lock or handle on this side of it. Of course, for the door had been made for getting in, not for getting out. But there was a catch, as there often is. "Shall I?" said Diggory. "I'm game if you are," said Polly, just as she had said before, but both felt that it was becoming very serious, but neither could draw back. No one would turn around. Diggory pushed round the catch with some difficulty, and the door swung open, and the sudden daylight made them blink. Then, with a great shock, they saw that they were looking not into a deserted attic, but into a furnished room. It had furniture in it, but it still seemed empty enough. It was dead silent. Polly's curiosity got the better of her. She blew out her candle and she stepped out into the strange room, making no more noise than a mouse. It was shaped, of course, like an attic, but furnished as a sitting room or a living room. Every bit of the walls were lined with shelves, and every bit of the shelves were full of books. A fire was burning. You remember that it's a very cold, wet summer this year. And in front of the fireplace, with its back toward them, was a high-backed armchair. Between the chair and Polly, and filling most of the middle of the room, was a big table piled with all sorts of things, printed books and books of the sort you write in, and ink bottles and pens and wax, sealing wax, and a microscope. But what she noticed first was a bright red wooden tray with a number of rings on it. Rings on it? They were in pairs, a yellow one matched up with a green one. They were no bigger than any ordinary rings, and no one could help noticing them, but because they were so bright. They were the most beautifully shiny things you could imagine. If Polly had been a very little younger, she would have wanted to put one in her mouth. The room was so quiet that you noticed the ticking of the clock at once. And yet, as she now found, it was not absolutely quiet either. There was a very, very faint humming sound. If vacuum cleaners had been invented in those days, Polly would have thought it was the sound of a vacuum cleaner from a long way off, several rooms away, and maybe several floors below. But it was a nicer sound than that, a more musical tone, only so faint that you could hardly hear it. It's all right. There's no one here, said Polly with a whisper. And Diggory came out blinking and looking extremely dirty, as indeed Polly looked too. This is no good, he said. It's not an empty house at all. We'd better leave before someone comes out. What do you think those are? Said Polly, pointing at the pretty colored rings. Oh, come on, said Diggory. He never finished his sentence. What he was going to say, for that moment something happened. The high back chair in front of the fireplace moved suddenly, and there rose up out of it a pantomime demon coming up out of a trap door. No, it was Uncle Andrew. They were not in the empty house at all. They were in Diggory's house and in the forbidden study. Both children said, "Oh!" and realized their terrible mistake, and they felt they ought to have known all along that they hadn't gone nearly far enough. Uncle Andrew was tall and very thin. He had a long, clean-shaven face with a sharply pointed nose and extremely bright eyes, and a great tousled mop of gray hair. Diggory was quite speechless, for Uncle Andrew looked 1,000 times more alarming than he had ever looked before. Polly was not so frightened yet, but she soon was. For the very first thing Uncle Andrew did was to walk across the door of the room, shut the door, and turn the key in the lock. Then he turned around, he fixed his eyes on the children, and he smiled, showing all of his teeth. There, he said. Now, my fool of a sister cannot get at you. It was dreadfully unlike anything a grown-up would be expected to do. Polly's heart came into her mouth, and she and Diggory started backing toward the little door behind them. Uncle Andrew was too quick for them, though, and he got behind them and he shut that door too. And he rubbed his hands and made his knuckles crack. He had very long, beautifully white fingers. I'm delighted to see you, he said. 2 children are just what I wanted. Please, Mr. Kettley, said Polly. It's nearly my time for dinner, and I've got to go home. Will you please let us out? Not just yet, said Uncle Andrew. This is too good an opportunity to miss. I wanted 2 children, you see. I'm in the middle of a great experiment. I've tried it on a guinea pig, and it seemed to work. But then a guinea pig can't tell you anything, and you can't explain to it how to come back. Look here, Uncle Andrew, said Diggory. It really is dinner time, and they'll be looking for us in a moment. You must let us out. Must, said Uncle Andrew. Diggory and Polly glanced at one another. They dared not say a thing, but the glances meant, isn't this dreadful? And we must humor him. If you let us go for dinner now, said Polly, we could come back after dinner. Ah, but how do I know you would come back? Said Uncle Andrew with a cunning smile. And then he seemed to change his mind. Well, well, he said. If you really must go, I suppose you must. I can't expect 2 youngsters like you to find it much fun talking to an old buffer like me. He sighed and he went on. You've no idea how lonely it is sometimes, but no matter. Go to your dinner. But I must give you a present before you go. It's not every day that you see a little girl in my dingy old study, especially, if I may say so, such a very attractive young lady as yourself. Polly began to think he might not really be crazy at all. Wouldn't you like this ring, my dear? He said. Do you mean one of those yellow or green ones? Said Polly. How lovely. Not a green one, said Uncle Andrew. I'm afraid I can't give you the green ones, but I'd be delighted to give you one of the yellow ones with my love. Come and try one on. Polly had now quite got over her fright, and she felt sure that the old gentleman was not crazy, and there was certainly something strangely attractive about the bright rings. She moved over to the tray. Oh, why, I declare, she said, the humming gets louder as I get closer. It's almost as if the rings were making that hum. What a funny face, my dear, said Uncle Andrew with a laugh. It sounded a very natural laugh, but Diggory had seen an eager, almost a greedy look on his face. Polly, don't be fooled, said Diggory. Don't touch them. But it was too late. Exactly as he spoke, Polly's hand went out to touch one of the rings, and immediately, without a flash or a noise or a warning of any sort, there was no Polly. Diggory and his uncle were alone in the room.